Hello, my name's Jules, and welcome to The Secret Mind. Today, I found when I got up in the morning, I wanted to talk to you about ghosts. So I'm still opening strands on this channel instead of closing them down, but over time it will become more elegantly stratified. I've always had a bit of a fascination with ghost stories, but it's hard to find a good one, isn't it? My old school teacher wrote a book on ghosts because I'm from the most haunted place in the world. The most haunted place in Britain, which must be the most haunted place in the world. York, the city of. And this is the book he wrote, Ghosts by John Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell, as we would call him. He always used to leave his sausage dog in the car with the window slightly open. And he wrote this book, and it was illustrated partly, I thought, totally by the art teacher. But it was just the gargoyles of York Minster that he copied, the grotesques that he copied. I think these other illustrations look like, what do they call them? Those lithographs. Is that right? And but they're not by him. He was my art teacher as well. He didn't have very much to teach me because I can't do art, as I think I've previously shared. So I thought I might look at this. So I've got 3 books here with me off my bookcase, all of which are using up space, but all of which need to earn their place. So he would tell his stories of the real ghosts of York. He wouldn't tell them. I don't remember him ever telling us those stories. He was a history teacher mainly, and he'd get us to titivate our borders. That was his word. He'd get us to titivate them. So we had to put an inch border on either side, and we had to decorate them for him. And he didn't accept any of our homework unless those were decorated in pretty colours. He was a confirmed bachelor, I believe, but you have to have a hobby, don't you? And and so that's his book, which will be stories about ghosts. But as he says in the beginning intro, which I'm not going to read you, this is the 3rd edition, but he says at the bottom, "Here then, without frills or fantasies, are the original tales." John Mitchell, archivist. And he claims in the dedicated to us, the boys of the school, who first badgered me into telling some of these ancient tales. Really? Who badgered them? Who badgered him? So that's that. Now the first one, well, I'll come to that in a second. This is another book of ghosts. This is a cheap book I bought years ago. I put a bookmark in there just on the first story because $2.99. You've seen these kind of books. I mean, are they any good? They look more like real crime, don't they? True crime. And a lot of them have horror. I think, well, I say a lot of them. I've never read it. It's been on my bookshelf forever. Never read it. Are they any good or not? But they're going to be a little bit more dramatized, I think. A little bit more salacious, a little bit more horror, more heads, more severed hands, that sort of thing. Be warned. And then I've got something else here, which is The Ghost Stories of Oliver Onions. And I'm pretty sure I bought this. It's quite a modern copy. I don't know if it's a modern edition. It's a modern printing. 2010, you see. So, pretty recent. But he was around 150 years ago, I think. Oh, born in Bradford, Yorkshire in November 1873. He had the bluff, no-nonsense characteristics of the native Yorkshireman. And although proud of his unusual name, Oliver Onions, he was taunted at school because of it. And in 1918 he changed it to George Oliver, partly to please his wife, who found it distasteful. And probably also to prevent his 2 young sons suffering the same humiliation that he'd experienced. Oh, there we go. So, these are Yorkshire men talking about ghosts. I don't know who wrote this. I doubt he achieved the requirements of being from Yorkshire. It's not for everybody. So I'm going to read some of them to you, and then we can all go home. This one is just the first one in the book. It's called The Bar Guest Legend. And I'm not sure which of these are really going to, capture your imagination most. But we were talking the other day about writing a poem. Why can't you relate a ghost story. It's a thing, isn't it? That's a real skill if you could do that. If you had a party trick, but a party trick is something that you can do when the lights go down, when Netflix isn't available, and when the lights go down. What better thing to do than to tell a ghost story? So if I get to do more of these, if I put in a series, I'd get my sound right, I'd get the mood right. Probably add on a creepy soundtrack underneath it. But that will depend if anybody wants to hear them. Anyway, for today, I'm going to just experiment with these different formats. The facts from Mr. Mitchell, the slightly dramatised, salacious books from The World's Greatest Ghosts, and stories that are developed out of this genre by somebody who's considered a master of the art, Oliver Onions, but whose name, despite its uniqueness, isn't widely known. And if I forgot to say, I think it's Mark Gatiss who name-checked him on something, who's the main vendor of the ghost story nowadays. So let's do this. This is Ghosts with from the city of York. The Barghest legend. Now this isn't easy to read. You're going to find out why, but just bear with me. It's less than a page. Belief in the Barghest, a spectral hound of gigantic proportions, has long been part of popular superstition and folklore, and there are references to a Barghest being seen on the walls and in the castle of York. Although the setting of the following account in the Leeds Mercury supplement of February the 28th, 1881 is not York, it is at least Yorkshire, and the dialect is as interesting as the story. You have been warned. You see, sir, said Billy, as how I'd been a clock dressing at Grassington, it were about 11 o'clock when I left, and were a back at end at year, and it were a grand neat. To moon were vera breet. I were passing down t' mill, and I heard summat come past me. Brush, 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 with chains rattling at while, but I seed nowt, and thou hast to me sen. Now this is a most mortal, and thou hast to me sen. Now this is a most mortal queer thing. Then he heard this brush, brush, brush with chains, for you see, when I stewed still it stopped, and then thou't I, this mun be a Barghest, and I hurried on towards Woodbrig, for they said as our Barghest cannot cross water. But Lord, sir, when I gat over to Brig, I heard this same thing again, and then I became a valiant man, for I were a bit frightened before, and thinks I'll turn and have a peep at this thing. So I turned back to gan him, but I'd hardly reached door when I heard this brush and chains. I followed it, and to mooing then shone vera bright, and I seed it all. Then thou old thing, I can say I've seen thee now, so I went to him. When I got to door, there were a girt thing like a sheep, but it were bigger ligging across threshold at door, and it were woolly like. And says I, get up, and it wouldn't get up. Then says I, stir thyself, and it wouldn't stir itself. And I grew valiant, and raised it to baste it up, and then it looked at me, and such joys they did lower, and were as big as saucers, and like a cruel bow. First there were a red ring, then a blue one, then a white one, and these rings grew less and less till they came to a dot. Now I were nane feared on it, though it grinned at me fearfully, and I kept on saying, get up and stir thyself. And to I feared our were at door, and she'd come to open it. And then this thing had got up and walk off, for it were more feared at wife than it were a me. And I'd call wife, and she said it were to Barghest. But I've never seen it since, and that's a true story. Now that is quite a workout to read if you think it, but don't worry, I don't think they're all like that. So what is interesting about that, I've never come across this idea of a Barghest, B-A-R-G-U-E-S-T. It's a dog, a spectral dog. And the interesting thing about it, apart from we know spectral dogs, don't we? Because Hound of the Baskervilles was a bit like that. Was it can't cross water. It can't go past water. And those of you who saw my video on my Love Isn't cards, I was talking to Kit Williams, the writer of Masquerade, and we had a chat about folklore, because he would get tales of folklore, weave some of the stories into his paintings, sorry, I just paused the recording, so I've never done that before. I don't know how it'll come out, but we're not dealing in perfection here anyway. That was somebody trying to tell me my internet needed attention, which of course was a big fat lie. So yeah, a bar guess. So Kit Williams was talking about folklore and was talking about these creatures that couldn't cross water. So that is obviously a common theme, isn't it? Because that's another one, same sort of idea. And I bet if you look at these folklore things, a lot of these themes will recur. So that's the only thing I want to read you from John Mitchell's Ghost Stories. Now I'm going to read something from The World's Greatest Ghosts. I mean, even the title. So this is a bit more of a salacious style, I think, but I've not read this, but the title is salacious. The Bloodstone Ring. Severed hand trapped a killer. So it's all a bit more, it's a different style of stuff, isn't it? So I'm just going to give it a go. Discover it with you. Gale force winds lash the tiny village of Willisham, ripping slates from the roofs and tearing limbs from trees. A huge old oak shuddered before the onslaught, and then, caught by one mighty gust, toppled, its roots tearing at the earth beneath. Villagers who rushed to the spot to see if anyone was hurt stopped in horror as they gazed between the gnarled roots. There lay some human remains. Police Constable Clug, the only bobby in the East Anglian community, was called, and he ordered that the body be taken from its strange grave. One of the dismembered hands had a ring on one finger. Acting on a hunch, the grim-faced constable carried the hand to Ellen Gray, sister of a girl who had vanished mysteriously 18 years before, in 1873. Ellen screamed, and then hugged the ghastly relic to her breast. "It's Mary's," she sobbed. "The bloodstone ring was my wedding gift. She was born in March, and it was her birthstone." Clug understood. Though the case was before his time, it was so well known in the area, it had been the subject of a popular ballad. On her 18th birthday, Mary Gray had married Basil Osborne. She'd written a letter to John Bodneys, her sweetheart since childhood, asking for his forgiveness. An hour before the groom was to take her away on the honeymoon, Mary told her sister she wanted to spend a little time alone in the upstairs room they'd shared. When Osborne arrived with the carriage, she still hadn't come down. Frightened, they forced their way into the locked room, but found no trace of the bride. One window opened onto a balcony where a flight of steps led to an enclosed garden, but the garden too was empty. The abandoned bridegroom died a month later. The villagers blamed a broken heart. Now, 18 years later, the village knew what had become of Mary, for the skeleton had a broken neck. Ellen refused to give up her murdered sister's hand. It had been brought to her for a purpose, she said. That purpose must be fulfilled. Dying, she left a bizarre provision in her will. Her housekeeper, Maggie Williams, was to have her estate, but must display the hand in some public place where it may someday confront the murderer. Maggie opened what became the first pub in Willisham, and gave the hand a place of honour on one wall. Enclosed in glass against a black velvet background, the bony, ringed fingers claimed the attention of everyone. After the shock of the exhibit had worn away, the tale of Mary's murder was a frequent topic of conversation. On a dismal March night in 1895, a stranger sat listening to scraps of the talk. Might have been just such a night as this that the wind ripped out that old oak tree, said the publican. The stranger, a brooding man with a ravaged face, looked up from his glass. I don't understand. What oak tree? He asked. Have a look at the case on the wall and then we'll tell you the story, the barman told him. Moments later, the stranger was screaming. He sagged against the wall, blood dripping from his fingers. An older man at the bar recognised him as Mary's missing former sweetheart, John Bodneys. When Constable Clugg arrived, the bleeding man confessed to the murder of Mary Gray. In a frenzy of jealousy, he had found the bride alone in her room. Muffling her cries, he carried her from the house. Bodneys insisted he had not meant to kill her, but they reached the big oak tree, and she was struggling so hard he had broken her neck. He left her in a shallow grave under the oak and tried to put Willisham behind him forever, but there had never been a moment of peace since the crime, and inevitably he had been compelled to return. Committed to the local jail to await trial, he died of no known disease before his trial could be held. The authorities dismissed the old wives' tale that a murderer's hands sometimes drip blood when he faces the proof of his crime, but the people of the village knew what they'd seen. They buried Mary Gray's hand with the rest of her skeleton, and then ceremoniously burned the shirt smeared by John Bodney's bloody fingers the day he came face to face with his guilt. That's rather good, isn't it? Rather good. Nicely put together. So, I think these are... How much truth do they have in them, do we think? Who knows? I mean, I can trust my old form teacher for those being accurately passed on, but that's an interesting story. I'm not going to Google it. I don't know how famous it is. Maybe it's really famous around that way. Right. Moving on to, here we go, The Dead of Night. Now, Oliver Onions did long stories and short stories, and this has got probably pretty much all of them in. Well, the ghost stories of Oliver Onions, so presumably it's got all of them in. I was going to read you the shortest one I could find, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to read the most famous one he ever did, which achieved great notoriety. Well, plaudits for being his best. I didn't know it. I still don't know it. I've never read it, but I've heard Mark Gatiss interviewed saying that he wanted to film it sometime, and I don't think, as far as I know, he's got around to doing that yet. He will. It's called The Beckoning Fair One. I don't even understand the title. I have looked it up in the past, but I don't know. And I'm only going to do the first chapter because it's very short. So, this is The Beckoning Fair One by Oliver Onions, Chapter 1. The 3 or 4 to-let boards had stood within the low paling as long as the inhabitants of the little triangular square could remember. And if they had ever been vertical, it was a very long time ago. They now overhung the palings, each at its own angle, and resembling nothing so much as a row of wooden choppers, ever in the act of falling upon some passer-by, yet never cutting off a tenant for the old house from the stream of his fellows. Not that there was ever any great stream through the square. The stream passed a furlong and more away, beyond the intricacy of tenements and alleys and byways that had sprung up since the old house had been built, hemming it in completely. And probably the house itself was only suffered to stand pending the falling in of a lease or two, when doubtless a clearance would be made of the whole neighbourhood. It was of bloomy old red brick, and built into its walls were the crowns and clasp hands and other insignia of insurance companies long since defunct. The children of the secluded square had swung upon the low gate at the end of the entrance alley, until little more than the solid top bar of it remained, and the alley itself ran past boarded basement windows on which tramps had chalked their cryptic marks. The path was washed and worn, uneven by the spilling of water, from the eaves of the encroaching next house, and cats and dogs had made the approach their own. The chances of a tenant did not seem such as to warrant the keeping of the to let boards in a state of legibility and repair, and as a matter of fact, they were not so kept. For 6 months, Oleron had passed the old place twice a day or oftener on his way from his lodgings to the room, 10 minutes' walk away. He had taken to work in, and for 6 months no hatchet-like notice board had fallen across his path. This might have been due to the fact that he usually took the other side of the square, but he chanced one morning to take the side that ran past the broken gate and the rain-worn entrance alley, and to pause before one of the inclined boards. The board bore, beside the agent's name, the announcement, written apparently about the time of Oleron's own early youth, that the key was to be had at number 6. Now Oleron was already paying for his separate bedroom and workroom, more than an author who, without private means, habitually disregards his public can afford. And he was paying, in addition, a small rent for the storage of the greater part of his grandmother's furniture. Moreover, it invariably happened that the book he wished to read in bed was at his working quarters 1/2 mile and more away, while the note or letter he had sudden need of during the day was as likely as not to be in the pocket of another coat hanging behind his bedroom door. And there were other inconveniences in having a divided domicile. Therefore, Oleron, brought suddenly up by the hatchet-like notice board, looked first down through some scanty privet bushes at the boarded basement windows, then up at the blank and grimy windows of the first floor, and so up to the second floor and the flat coping stone of the leads. He stood for a minute, thumbing his lean and shaven jaw. Then, with another glance at the board, he walked slowly across the square to number 6. He knocked and waited for 2 or 3 minutes, but although the door stood open, received no answer. He was knocking again when a long-nosed man in shirt sleeves appeared. "I was asking a blessing on our food," he said in severe explanation. Oleron asked if he might have the key of the old house, and the long-nosed man withdrew again. Oleron waited another 5 minutes on the step, then the man appearing again and masticating some of the food of which he had spoken, announced that the key was lost. "But you won't want it," he said. "The entrance door isn't closed, and a push'll open any of the others. I'm an agent for it, if you're thinking of taking it." Oleron recrossed the square, descended the 2 steps at the broken gate, passed along the alley, and turned in at the old wide doorway. To the right, immediately within the door, steps descended to the roomy cellars, and the staircase before him had a carved rail, and was broad and handsome and filthy. Oleron ascended it, avoiding contact with the rail and wall, and stopped at the first landing. A door facing him had been boarded up, but he pushed on that, on his right hand, and an insecure bolt, or staple, yielded. He entered the empty first floor. He spent a quarter of an hour in the place, and then came out again. Without mounting higher, he descended and recrossed the square to the house of the man who had lost the key. "Can you tell me how much the rent is?" he asked. The man mentioned a figure, the comparative lowness of which seemed accounted for by the character of the neighbourhood and the abominable state of unrepair of the place. Would it be possible to rent a single floor? The long-nosed man did not know. They might... Who are they? Who are they? The man gave Oleron the name of a firm of lawyers in Lincoln's Inn. "You might mention my name, Barrett," he added. Pressure of work prevented Oleron from going down to Lincoln's Inn that afternoon, but he went on the morrow and was instantly offered the whole house as a purchase for £50 down, the remainder of the purchase money to remain on mortgage. It took him half an hour to disabuse the lawyer's mind of the idea that he wished anything more of the place than to rent a single floor of it. This made certain hums and haws of a difference, and the lawyer was by no means certain that it lay within his power to do as Oleron suggested, but it was finally extracted from him, provided that the notice boards were allowed to remain up, and that, provided it was agreed that in the event of the whole house letting, the arrangement should terminate automatically without further notice, something might be done. That the old place should suddenly let over his head seemed to Oleron the slightest of risks to take, and he promised a decision within a week. On the morrow, he visited the house again, went through it from top to bottom, and then went home to his lodgings to take a bath. He was immensely taken with that portion of the house he had already determined should be his own, scraped clean and repainted, and with that old furniture of Oleron's grandmother's, it ought to be entirely charming. He went to the storage warehouse to refresh his memory of his half-forgotten belongings, and to take measurements, and thence he went to a decorator's. He was very busy with his regular work, and could have wished that the notice board had caught his attention either a few months earlier or else later in the year, but the quickest way would be to suspend work entirely until after his removal. A fortnight later, his first floor was painted throughout in a tender elderflower white. The paint was dry, and Oleron was in the middle of his installation. He was animated, delighted, and he rubbed his hands as he polished and made disposals of his grandmother's effects. The tall, lattice-paned china cupboard with its Derby and Mason and Spode, the large folding Sheraton table, the long, low bookshelves. He had had 2 of them copied, the chairs, the Sheffield candlesticks, the riveted rose bowls. These things he set against his newly painted elder white walls, walls of wood panelled in the happiest proportions, and moulded and coffered to the low-seated window recesses, in a mood of gaiety and rest that the builders of rooms no longer know. The ceilings were lofty and faintly painted with an old pattern of stars. Even the tapering mouldings of his iron fireplace were as delicately designed as jewellery, and Oleron walked about, rubbing his hands, frequently stopping for the mere pleasure of glimpses from white room to white room. Charming, charming, he said to himself. I wonder what Elsie Bengough will think of this. He bought a bolt and a Yale lock for his door, and shut off his quarters from the rest of the house. If he now wanted to read in bed, his book could be had for stepping into the next room. All the time he thought how exceedingly lucky he was to get the place. He put up a hat rack in the little square hall, and hung up his hats and caps and coats. And passers through the small triangular square late at night, looking up at the little serried row of wooden to-let hatchets, could see the light within Oleron's red blinds, or else the sudden darkening of one blind and the illumination of another, as Oleron, candlestick in hand, passed from room to room, making final settlings of his furniture, or preparing to resume the work that his removal had interrupted. That is the first chapter of The Beckoning Fair 1. Nothing much happens. The chap goes and rents a floor of an old derelict house. Now, there's a word there, serried. You seen that? Looking up over the little serried row of wooden to-let hatchets. Serried means adjective standing close together of people or things. Serried. A serried row, or just where things stand close together. New word to me. That's it. So there are lots of other chapters of that. If anybody's interested in me reading, you could let me know. I might just do it anyway. Because it's a classic. It's his most famous story and considered one of the greatest ghost stories ever written. So that's why I thought I'd start off with that rather than something that is a short one and not very good. It's his best stuff. We need to start with the best because I'm going to need some momentum to get through that. So that's my introduction to ghost stories and thinking about them. See you tomorrow.